The night was alive in Kumasi. Bright lights sparkled across the grand hall, music drifted through the air, and the scent of rich perfumes mixed with the laughter of well-dressed guests. Women shimmered in gowns that glowed under the chandeliers, their jewelry catching every flicker of light. Men stood tall in tailored suits, sipping wine and speaking with pride about business, travels, and politics. It was the kind of gathering where status spoke louder than words, and appearances carried more weight than truth. Into this glittering sea of glamour walked Adjoa. She did not wear the shining silk dresses or the gold necklaces that others flaunted. Her dress was plain, modest, almost out of place. The moment she stepped inside, heads turned. The whispers began quickly, soft at first, then spreading like ripples in water. Some guests exchanged amused glances, others tilted their heads with smirks tugging at their lips. The brightness of the hall seemed to dim around her as eyes followed her every step, not with admiration, but with judgment. She couldn't dress better for this night, someone muttered. Laughter, hushed but sharp, answered. The mocking traveled through the crowd as though her presence itself was a spectacle. While others glittered like diamonds, she was treated like a stain on silk. Her simple entrance became a stage, and every cruel whisper, every sidelong glance was a performance of ridicule. Adjoa kept walking, steady, her face calm, but the storm of judgment had already begun. The whispers soon grew louder, and laughter began to follow Adjoa wherever she walked. She had barely taken her seat when one of her cousins leaned across the table with a crooked smile and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Adjoa, is this what you call a party dress? My house help dresses better than this." The people around the table chuckled, covering their mouths as if to soften the cruelty, but the sting was sharp. Her husband's in-laws joined in, fanning the flames of mockery. An aunt, heavy with gold bangles clinking on her wrists, sneered, "Ah, our son has really brought us a village bride. Look at how she disgraces us in public. Even ordinary market women dress finer." The comment was met with open laughter this time, the kind that rolls through a group and makes strangers feel united in their ridicule. As Adjoa sat quietly, a group of her husband's friends, men who had never liked her, raised their glasses and called out across the hall, "Ei, village girl! Kumasi big party is not like your small-town funerals. Next time wear something proper." Their voices carried, and people nearby burst into laughter. Some even clapped as though it were entertainment. Adjoa's ears burned, but she stayed still. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat tightly, her knuckles pale. Inside her, tears pressed hard against her eyes, begging to fall, but she refused to let them win. Her chin lifted ever so slightly, not in arrogance but in quiet strength. She could feel the heat of humiliation spreading through her body, each word like fire on her skin. Still, she held her silence. To speak now would be to show weakness, and she would not give them that victory. Children of wealthy families pointed at her, giggling as their mothers whispered judgment. Women in glittering gowns walked past her, their perfumes heavy, their voices loud with mockery, as if she were invisible except for her shame. Every corner she turned, she heard her name followed by laughter. The air around her grew heavy, suffocating, but her eyes never lost their fire. Adjoa's heart thudded in her chest, a battle between pride and pain. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was more than the dress she wore, more than the poor girl they tried to paint her as. But she swallowed the words, burying them deep inside. Silence was her shield. Her calm face, her steady eyes, these were her weapon. Let them laugh, she thought. One day they would see the truth. So she sat there, surrounded by glitter and cruelty, her body quiet, but her spirit burning like a flame that could not be put out. They saw a village girl in a cheap dress, but what they did not see was the power rising quietly within her. And that power, though hidden tonight, was waiting for its moment. Long before this night of humiliation, Adjoa's life had been a long road of battles. She was only a child when she lost both her parents. The memory of that time still clung to her like a shadow. Her mother's gentle voice was gone too soon, and her father's strong hands never came back to guide her. She was left with nothing but grief and a small bag of clothes. It was her grandmother, an old woman with wrinkled hands and tired eyes, who gathered her into her arms and became both mother and father to her. Her grandmother did not have money, but she had wisdom, love, and an unshakable belief in education. Every morning, she would wake Adjoa before dawn, pushing her to study, encouraging her to dream beyond their tiny home. "The world may not give you anything, but if you fight for knowledge, you can claim your place," she always said. Those words sank deep into Adjoa's heart. Even when she had no shoes for school and sometimes no food for her stomach, she carried those words like treasure. Adjoa studied under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, her eyes burning late into the night. She was one of the brightest in her class, often topping exams despite the struggles. Teachers praised her, friends admired her determination, but life had a different plan. Just when she was dreaming of going further with her education, of maybe becoming a teacher or a lawyer, she was forced into marriage at a young age. The marriage was not her choice. It was arranged, and she had no power to resist. Her grandmother wept quietly, knowing that the dreams they had built together were being snatched away. Adjoa entered her husband's home carrying nothing but her humble past and the strength of her spirit. From the very beginning, she was treated as an outsider. Her husband's family never let her forget where she came from. They spoke to her as if poverty was a disease, as if her roots made her unworthy of respect. "Our son deserves better than a poor girl raised by an old woman," they whispered behind her back. Even to her face, they made sharp remarks. When she served food, they found fault. When she dressed, they called her cheap. At every gathering, they reminded her that she was lucky to be part of their family, as if her only value was the marriage itself. Still, Adjoa endured. She swallowed her pain, carrying it quietly in her heart. She smiled when she wanted to cry, worked harder when she wanted to rest, and prayed for strength when she felt like giving up. She knew that life had stolen her parents, stolen her education, and even stolen her freedom of choice, but it could not steal her determination. Somewhere deep inside, she promised herself that she would rise, no matter how long it took, no matter how many times they mocked her. What they didn't know was that every insult was shaping her, every struggle was sharpening, and every wound was building the woman who would one day stand tall before. Adjoa had learned to live with silence. It became her shield, her way of surviving in a world that never gave her credit. While people mocked her, while her in-laws whispered that she was nothing, she worked quietly, building her strength in ways they never saw. Her husband, celebrated as a rising businessman in Kumasi, often stood proudly in front of crowds, shaking hands with powerful men and smiling for photographs. But behind those moments of glory was Adjoa. She was the one who stayed up late, balancing his accounts when he didn't understand the numbers. She was the one who researched opportunities, drafted proposals, and corrected his speeches so he could stand tall without stumbling. Many times, she even connected him with people through her own hidden network, but she never claimed the credit. When his business grew, the world clapped for him, never knowing it was Adjoa's hands pushing him forward. To do all this, she sacrificed her own dreams. She had once imagined working for an international organization, helping children like the one she used to be, hungry, forgotten, but full of potential. But every time the chance appeared, she let it go. When her grandmother fell sick, she stayed by her side instead of chasing further education. When her husband demanded her full attention at home, she gave it. When his family mocked her for being just a wife, she bit her tongue and kept serving them. Still, Adjoa did not waste her talent. She worked quietly, creating projects that nobody knew she was behind. She built connections with NGOs, wrote proposals that attracted funding, and even designed small programs that fed children in rural areas. Yet she never put her name on them. She let others take the credit, because she knew the world would not celebrate a woman like her, especially one they had already labeled a poor village girl. Every night, when the house was quiet, she sat alone with her notebook, writing plans, dreams, and goals. She told herself, one day the world will see me. But for now, let them laugh. Let them think I am nothing. Her silence was not weakness. It was strategy. She knew her time would come, and when it did, it would be louder than all the voices that tried to bury her. The truth was, Adjoa was already powerful. She had achievements hidden in plain sight, victories disguised as favors to others. She was the invisible hand lifting everyone else, yet she stood in the shadows so they could shine. People thought her silence meant emptiness, but really it meant strength. She carried the weight of her husband's success, her family's survival, and her own hidden empire, all without recognition. Adjoa endured every insult because she knew something the rest of them didn't. Her worth did not need their approval. She was waiting, quietly, patiently, for the day her silence would no longer hide her power but reveal it. And when that day came, it would shake the very ground beneath those who mocked her. The night grew colder for Adjoa, even though the hall was warm and filled with music. She had already endured the whispers, the laughter, the cutting remark. But just when she thought the mockery might end, another cruelty struck. She was standing quietly by the drinks table, holding a glass of water, when a woman in a sparkling red gown walked past. With a sly smile, she accidentally tilted her glass of wine, sending the deep red liquid splashing across Adjoa's simple dress. The stain spread quickly, dark and heavy, like blood blooming on cloth. Gasps filled the air for a moment, but they quickly turned into laughter. "Oh dear, I'm so clumsy," the woman said with fake sweetness, though her smirk told the truth. She wasn't sorry. She had done it to humiliate her. Around them, guests chuckled, some covering their mouths, others laughing openly. "Maybe now her dress will finally have some color," one man called out, and the crowd roared even louder. Adjoa froze. She felt the cold wetness seep into her skin, the sharp smell of wine rising to her nose. Her fingers trembled around the edge of the table, but her face stayed still. Inside, though, her heart was breaking into pieces. The humiliation pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. It wasn't just the dress that was ruined. It was her dignity being torn apart in front of everyone. She turned her head slightly, searching for the one person who should have been by her side, her husband. He was standing not far away, laughing with a group of men. He saw what had happened. He saw her standing there, drenched in shame, but he did not move. Not a step, not a word. He looked at her, then quickly turned away, pretending to be absorbed in his conversation. That moment cut deeper than any insult. It told her she was truly alone. The hall was alive with cruel joy. Women whispered loudly, "How embarrassing. She should have stayed home." Others shook their heads with mock pity. A village girl will always remain a village girl. Adjoa heard it all, every word slicing through her like a knife. Her hands itched to wipe the stain, to run away, to scream. But she did none of that. Instead, she lifted her head, her eyes steady and burning. The wine dripped from her dress, staining the floor, but she refused to let them see her tears. She swallowed them back, burying her pain deep inside. In that moment, she understood something clearly. She could not depend on anyone to defend her, not even the man she had given her life to. If she was going to rise, it would be by her own strength. The laughter echoed, cruel and sharp, but somewhere beneath it, a new fire lit inside her. A fire that no spilled wine, no mockery, and no silence from her husband could ever put out. The music faded for a moment as the host of the night, a tall man in a sharp white suit, took the microphone. He looked around the hall, smiling like he carried the power of the whole evening in his hand. His eyes landed on Adjoa, standing in her stained dress, her quiet presence still a source of gossip among the crowd. He grinned, and with a voice that dripped with mockery, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we should hear from our special guest tonight. Madam Adjoa, won't you say a few words?" The hall erupted with laughter. Glasses clinked, hands clapped mockingly, and people whispered eagerly, already preparing themselves for the embarrassment they thought would follow. "What will she even say?" one woman giggled. "Maybe she will thank us for showing her how to dress properly," another chimed in. Even her husband shifted uncomfortably, wishing she would just decline and spare him the shame. But Adjoa did not refuse. She did not shrink back. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, her face calm, her posture steady. Every eye followed her as she walked toward the stage, the red stain on her dress still visible under the lights. She looked fragile, but there was something unshakable in the way she carried herself. The host, still smirking, handed her the microphone as if giving her a weapon he was sure she couldn't use. Adjoa's fingers closed around it firmly. For a moment, she stood in silence, scanning the faces of the hall. The laughter began to fade, the whispers grew quieter, and a strange stillness filled the room. Nobody expected her to hold herself with such poise. They expected stuttering, awkwardness, maybe even tears. But instead, they were met with eyes that burned with quiet fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear. It was not the voice of a broken woman, but of someone who carried a truth larger than the room itself. "Thank you," she began, her words simple yet commanding. The crowd leaned in, caught off guard by her composure. She did not rush. She did not stumble. She spoke like someone who had waited for this very moment all her life. Each word carried weight, silencing those who had laughed at her minutes before. The same people who expected her to humiliate herself now sat frozen, their curiosity forcing them to listen. Adjoa stood on that stage, the microphone in her hand, no longer the quiet woman in a simple dress. She was something else now, strong, unshaken, and ready to turn the night upside down. The very stage that was meant to shame her had become her throne. And though no one knew it yet, they were about to hear a truth that would change everything. Adjoa held the microphone with steady hands, the hall so silent now that even the sound of a glass being set down felt loud. She looked around slowly, letting her eyes meet those of the same people who had mocked her only minutes ago. When she spoke, her voice carried through the hall, calm but powerful. "You all laugh at my dress," she said softly, "but you do not know my story. You see only what you want to see." A few guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some smirked, waiting for her to embarrass herself further. But Adjoa's voice grew stronger. "Tonight, you sit here at this beautiful event, eating, drinking, celebrating. But do you know who made most of this possible?" Whispers began to rise. People glanced at one another, unsure where she was going. Adjoa paused for a moment, then said clearly, "I am the CEO of an NGO that feeds thousands of children across Ghana. When mothers cry because they cannot feed their children, my organization is there. When schools struggle because children are too hungry to learn, we step in. I may not wear gold on my neck, but I carry the lives of many children in my hand." The hall was frozen. Forks stopped midair. Glasses trembled in people's hands. Adjoa continued, her voice unwavering. And this event you are celebrating tonight, this very charity, half of it was funded by me. Not through my husband, not through his family, but directly by me. I chose to keep my name silent because the work is about helping children, not about praise. Yet tonight, as I hear your laughter, I realize silence has been mistaken for weakness. Gasps spread through the crowd. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. A man who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of Adjoa's words was heavy, and no one dared to interrupt. Then she turned her gaze toward her husband. He looked pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. Adjoa's voice cut through the hall once more. And to those who call me a village girl, let me tell you the truth you never imagined. The business you celebrate my husband for, the company you all respect, without me it would not exist. I am the major investor. I used the money I worked for, the connections I built, to make it possible. While you laughed at me, I was the one building the foundation you now applaud. The silence in the hall was no longer ordinary. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with shame. Faces dropped. The same people who had sneered at her dress now could not meet her eyes. Her husband stood frozen, his pride stripped away in front of everyone. Adjoa stood tall, her stained dress still clinging to her. But in that moment, she was brighter than every jewel in the room. The truth had been revealed, and no one would ever see her the same again. The moment Adjoa's words left her lips, the hall changed completely. The same people who had been laughing and clapping only minutes ago now sat in stunned silence. The air felt heavy, almost too heavy to breathe. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to smile. It was as if the chandeliers themselves dimmed in shame. The wealthy cousins who had called her dress cheap lowered their eyes to their plates, their laughter gone, replaced by red faces and trembling hands. The aunt who had loudly called her a village bride tried to fix her scarf nervously, as though hiding behind it. She couldn't bring herself to look at Adjoa anymore. Every insult they had thrown at her now echoed back in their own ears, sharp and cruel. The friends of her husband, who had mocked her openly and called her a village girl, now sat frozen, their glasses untouched. One of them, who had shouted the loudest, stared at the floor as though wishing it would swallow him whole. The shame was thick, spreading like smoke across the room, and there was no escape from it. Gasps came from the corners of the hall, small cries of disbelief. People covered their mouths. Others shook their heads slowly, unable to accept that the woman they had mocked so mercilessly was the very reason they were all sitting in that hall celebrating. Some even shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if the chairs had suddenly become too hard to bear. And then there was her husband. He stood stiff, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. He could not look at his wife, nor could he look at the crowd. His pride, once shining so brightly in front of his friends, now lay shattered at his feet. He remembered every moment he had stayed silent when she was insulted, every time he had chosen to laugh along rather than defend her. Now the truth stood tall before him, and guilt washed over him like a flood. The hall was quiet, so quiet that Adjoa's steady breathing could almost be heard. She stood there in her stained dress, calm and unshaken, while around her, the people who once mocked her shrank into themselves. Their glamorous clothes, their gold jewelry, their expensive perfumes, all of it suddenly felt useless in the presence of her truth. No one laughed anymore. No one dared. Their faces told the story: shame, regret, disbelief, and fear. They had judged her by her dress, by her silence, by her background, and now they realized how blind they had been. Adjoa had not just spoken words. She had held up a mirror, and what they saw in it made their faces turn pale. The hall that once roared with cruel laughter now bowed its head before her power. And in that silence, Adjoa stood taller than anyone else in the room. Adjoa stood for a long moment, holding the microphone with calm hand. The hall was so silent that the sound of a chair creaking felt like thunder. She looked around, her eyes meeting the faces of the same people who had laughed at her, mocked her, and stained her dress with cruelty. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady but carried the weight of something deeper than anger. It carried truth. "You judged me because of my dress," she began softly. "But let me tell you something tonight. Clothes do not measure the worth of a person. Jewelry does not measure the heart. Respect is not earned through gold or silk, but through the way we treat one another." Her words cut through the silence, landing heavy in every corner of the hall. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "For years, I stayed silent while people called me names. I let you believe I was small. But silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes, silence is strength waiting for the right moment. And tonight, I speak not just for myself, but for every woman, every man, every child who has ever been looked down on because of where they come from, what they wear, or how little they have." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some shifted in their seats, tears already glistening in their eyes. Adjoa continued, her voice rising with passion. "When you laughed at me, you were not just laughing at my dress. You were laughing at every child who goes hungry, at every poor woman who works day and night, at every person who struggles quietly while others mock their pain. And yet, it is those very people who carry the world on their shoulders. Her words broke something inside the room. A woman in the front row bowed her head and began to cry quietly. A man who had mocked her earlier covered his face with his hand, ashamed. Another stood up and said shakily, "I'm sorry, Adjoa." Adjoa looked around, her voice softening again. "Respect each other. Do not underestimate people by what you see on the outside. You never know who you are standing next to, you never know the battles they have fought, or the lives they are saving behind the scenes. True dignity is in kindness. True power is in humility. And true beauty is in the strength to rise when the world pushes you down." By the time she finished, tears were streaming down faces across the hall. Some people reached for her hands, others nodded through their sobs, whispering apology. And then, slowly, the sound of clapping began, soft at first, then growing louder and louder until the entire hall was on its feet. The applause roared, shaking the room, not for her dress, not for her silence, but for the power of her truth. In that moment, Adjoa was no longer the woman they mocked. She was the voice they would never forget. When the applause finally died down, Adjoa handed back the microphone and stepped down from the stage. She did not rush, she did not look shaken. She walked with calm, steady steps, her head high, her shoulders straight. The same people who had laughed at her earlier now moved aside with respect, some even bowing their heads as she passed. Her dress was still stained with wine, but in that moment, it no longer looked like shame, it looked like a crown. Her husband stood frozen, guilt heavy on his face, but Adjoa did not pause by his side. She walked past him without a word, the silence between them louder than anything she could have said. The hall remained quiet, almost reverent, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something far greater than a party. They had seen a woman transform humiliation into triumph. When she stepped outside into the cool Kumasi night, the whispers began again, but this time, they carried a different tone. Awe, admiration, respect. By the next morning, the story of what happened at the grand party had already spread across the city. People spoke of the woman in the simple dress who silenced an entire hall with truth. They called her strong, fearless, an example for every person who had ever been underestimated. From that night on, Adjoa was no longer just a name in her husband's shadow. She became a symbol of dignity and strength, a reminder that appearances mean nothing when true power is hidden inside. They laughed at her dress, but they will never forget her power.